All right, welcome back everybody. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome to Notes to Fret, where we are all about turning theory into riffs. And in this video, we are going to cover what you need to know to understand and learn modes. On the opposite side of this video is your understanding of modes. If you've ever struggled with modes, looked at them and thought to yourself that they were difficult, elusive, confusing, whatever it is, on the opposite side of this video is the solution to that. You will understand modes by the time that this video is done. So here what we're going to do is I'm going to look at talking about modes from 3 different areas. In each area I'm going to take 5 minutes on. Here we're going to start by looking at the typical way that modes are oftentimes portrayed or taught in some of the music theory books that are out there. It's just confusing. But the reason that we're going to go over this is so that you have a knowledge of it. We're not going to be looking at it from you fundamentally understanding it. If the information will be there 100%, but we're going to look at this first so that you have a knowledge of what is out there. So when people talk about it or their musicians come up with it, you'll understand what's going on. But we're ultimately going to look at that, kind of put it to the side, and then understand much better later on in the video really what we need to understand modes in a much, much simpler way. The second part we're going to look at is certain things that we as guitarists do to ourselves that make learning and understanding modes even more difficult. We do this to ourselves. Again, we're going to take 5 minutes on this one. And by the time that these two segments are pretty much taken care of, what we're going to do is then dive into clarity and understanding. That one may go a little bit more than 5 minutes, but generally speaking, you're about 15 to 20 minutes away of completely understanding what is going on with modes. And from here, this is everything you need to know about how modes they come together in a family. What it means to construct a mode from the major scale. From here, you'll be able to go into the individual videos on whatever mode you want to dive deeper into, right? But each one of those videos is pretty long, so I couldn't go into deep dive on all modes here. But regardless of that, like I said, on the other side of this video is your understanding of modes. Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead and start the clock. So right off the bat, we are looking at the 7 modes of the major scale: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. Crazy names. Whoa. If you've never heard them before, that's a little bit of a tongue twister. If you have heard them before, it's still kind of a tongue twister. It is important to understand the modes in this particular order. The way that I remember them in this order is I use the acronym of I don't punch like Muhammad Ali, right? That's how I remember them. I'm certain that there's other terms out there, but that's what I use. So here, the one mode that you're just going to have to remember is the Ionian mode. That's your major scale. Everything else can be constructed from the major scale, right? That's why we talk about these 7 modes of the major scale. It's because they're all built from the major scale. So right off the bat, that's our base. No change there. Then we hit Dorian. And then we say, okay, well, Dorian has a flattened 3rd and a flattened 7th, whatever. Then we come down to Phrygian. And then we say, okay, well, Phrygian has a flattened 2nd, a flattened 3rd, a flattened 6th, and a flattened 7th. Okay, sure, why not? Lydian will come down, we'll say it has a sharpened 4th. Okay. And then we'll say Mixolydian will come down, we'll say it has a flattened 7th. All right. Now we hit our minor, right? Our Aeolian, right? We all talk about A minor all the time. And here we're saying it's a flattened 3rd, a flattened 6th, and a flattened 7th. Well, right off the bat, we've talked about A minor more times than we can possibly comprehend. And one thing that's always been the base is A minor has no sharps and no flats. Okay, now we're saying that there's 3 flats. I don't get it, but we'll look at that in a little bit. Then there's a Locrian scale. This one is kind of the outlier, but regardless, it has a flattened second, flattened third, flattened fifth, flattened sixth, flattened seventh. Okay, right? Whole lot of stuff in here going on that's flattened. And, we got a sharpened and Lydian, but we'll come back to that. Another way that this gets presented is here in the major mode, right? We look at the major first, minor second, minor third, minor fourth, minor fifth, minor sixth, diminished seventh. And that's just your chords, right? So in C major, you have C major, then you have D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, right? That's what that's representing. So then we come down to Dorian and we go, okay, that's interesting. And then we have the third and the seventh, that's flattened. Then we come into Phrygian and now we have four flats, right? The second, the third, the sixth, and the seventh. Then we look at Lydian. All of a sudden we have a sharpened fourth. That's interesting. And Mixolydian, well, now it has a flattened seventh. Okay. And then we have our Aeolian, our minor scale, and it has three flats in it. Well, A minor does not have three flats. Very annoying here. But then we come down to Locrian. And we look at this and we go, whoa, there's five flats in that. And okay, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, whatever. But as you're looking at this table, and it all looks very, looks confusing out there. We've got this stuff in Ionian at the top. There's no sharps, no flats, nothing, right? So that would kind of say, okay, C major. But then again, we come down to Aeolian, which is our minor, and there's three flats, right? And if we've ever looked at our scales and we take our C and we kind of move up, well, there's still no flats, right? And so as we move up and down the fretboard, this looks kind of crazy. And then here's a bunch of flats, but we know that there's sharps in scales, right? So does that mean the only sharp that can possibly happen is in Lydian mode, right? So here, as you're looking at this, we've talked a whole lot about flattens, and it doesn't really jive on our scale. We've looked at C major and A minor, majority of the time. And so right now, if you kind of feel a little overwhelmed and you're like, oh my, none of this just does not make any sense, you're in the right place. Okay, so now that you're probably looking at this and going, oh my God, I've seen this before, I'm done, I'm out. Stick around, because again, if you got the headache, you're in the right place. And there's my 5 minutes. So what we're going to do now is we are going to jump into what we as guitarists tend to do to ourselves to make this even more complex. So with that, let's go ahead and start the clock. So here, when we look at the fretboard, here's our C major scale, right? We just start on C and we end on C. You can go out to this, whatever strings, and you might have a different pattern, but we all know this pattern, right? We start on C on the 8th fret on our low E string and go from there, right? So when we're looking at this, we go, okay, we start on C, we end on C, but I'm gonna start on D and end on D. And somehow I've come into the Dorian mode. And now you're telling me just by starting off on the D that somehow my third and my seventh are now flat? Like that doesn't really jive, right? My pattern on my scale, that doesn't show flat and third or flat and seventh or anything like that. So, then the next thing we do is we start on E. Now, I understand that some of you may play this, move down to the octave. I'm just going to go to the open string, right? It's still the same thing, right? So we start on E, F, G, A, B, C, right? We go to our scale and we stop on E. Now I'm in Phrygian. Okay, so now you're telling me I have four flats? That I'm looking at my fretboard and I'm looking at this pattern, and I do not have four flats. E Phrygian, I do not have four flats. And then you kind of take that one step further and say, okay, well, I'm going to move to Lydian now, apparently, because now I'm just going to randomly start on F and I'm going to end on F. And now somehow I'm in Lydian and I've got a sharp Like, no, the fourth is not sharp. I'm looking at it, no sharps, no flats. Okay, these modes in my scale patterns they're not matching up. Then we move into G, right? We've all seen this pattern. And now all of a sudden we're saying hocus pocus, you're in Mixolydian. And we're saying that Mixolydian has a flattened seventh. Well, that makes no sense at all. We're looking at the scale, the pattern that we know, and the seventh it's just saying, plain and simple, it's not flat, right? The seventh, by the way, here's the F. It's not flat. And now we move into our beloved A Aeolian, our A minor scale, which we know for a fact has no sharps and no flats. And yet over here in this table to the right, somehow I'm magically supposed to have 3 flats. I'm looking at A Aeolian or A minor, and you're telling me now magically I have 3 flats, and that's just not the case. I'm looking at the scale. It doesn't work. Now remember, this is the part I promised that we were going to talk about, how we make this more difficult on ourselves for guitar players, right? So if you're feeling lost and confused, that's okay. You're in the right place. So as promised. So when we're looking at this, we're saying, okay, here's our scales, or here's our modes, right? I've got C major, and I start on the low E string on the 8th fret. Well, then I want to test out Dorian. So I actually move the bullseye. I'm moving the goalpost. And so where we start, the next thing we do is for Dorian, we look at D Dorian. And we literally move the start of our scale to D. Okay? Now, we saw earlier that, okay, we moved to D, like it doesn't really matter that much. Then we say, okay, well, I want to look at Phrygian. And then we move our starting point to E. Now, you may start on the open string as well, like I showed a minute ago. But regardless, you're starting on E. And you're saying, okay, E Phrygian. Next thing we do is we want to evaluate Lydian. And what we do is we go to F. And now we're looking at F Lydian. Just so you know, D Dorian, E Phrygian, F Lydian, none of them have any sharps or flats. So then we move to G. We want to evaluate Mixolydian, so we literally move to G. What we are doing on the fretboard is moving the goalpost to make certain that we never hit a sharp or a flat. And G Mixolydian has no sharps, it has no flats. Same thing with A Aeolian. We once again move the goalpost, and now we're on the 5th fret on our low E string on the A to evaluate A Aeolian. Well, A minor A Aeolian has no sharps and no flats. Next thing we do, if we are going to look at Locrian, we move to the B, right? So we've moved the goalpost over and over. And then we're wondering, really, there are no sharps and no flats. Why are these modes, these things don't make sense. They're crazy. They're talking about, hyper flats and whatever. So these are the things that we as guitarists tend to do to ourselves. Might have gone a few seconds over with that one. But what I want to jump into now, next 5 minutes, is talk about some clarity. So let's go ahead and start the clock. Here, as we can see, we're comparing C major to D Dorian, C major to E Phrygian, C major to F Lydian, C major to G Mixolydian, C major to A Aeolian, C major to B Locrian. And it just seems pointless because there's no sharps, no flats. It just doesn't. However, truly what needs to be compared is C major to C Dorian, C major to C Phrygian, C major to C Lydian, C major to C Mixolydian, C major to C Aeolian or C minor, C major to C Locrian. Once you compare without moving the goalpost or the target, you will start to see the patterns that are emerging from the modes. But you have to compare without moving the patterns on the fretboard, right? So that's a major thing that we as guitarists tend to do to ourselves to make this stuff more confusing. But once you compare C to C, then or A to A or B to B, A sharp, F sharp, it doesn't matter. Then you'll start to see those patterns. So from here, looking back at, kind of this confusing looking table with all these flats, what I want to do is I want to compare a major to a minor, because that's the one we typically do, right? We typically C major to A minor, we compare that. But what I want to do is figure out what these flats are all about. And so as we're looking at it, at the top, I'm going to put in the major scale. I'm going to give myself a little bit of room here. At the top, we're going to have C sharp major, which is nothing but sharps, right? So let's figure out where these flats are coming in, but there's nothing but sharps. And I'm going to compare C sharp major to C sharp minor, okay? Now, C sharp minor has no flats in it whatsoever, none. So let's figure out what we're talking about when we talk about these flats in the Aeolian mode. All right, so I'm going to put the degrees of the scale in there, right? So we can see the third, first, second, third, whatever. And here, we'll notice that the third has that flattened symbol, right? So does that mean, if we're looking at the third, that E has to be flat? No, not at all. What this is actually saying is that E is flattened in the minor scale by way of comparison to the major scale. It doesn't mean that E is flat. It just means that the third degree has been flattened. And what does that really mean? Well, if we look at the top at the major scale, we see that we have E sharp. Well, if we flatten that by one semitone or one fret, we come back to E, right? So we've gone from E sharp to E. That's the flattened third. It doesn't mean that E has to be flat. It just means that the third is flattened. Well, let's look at the sixth. Well, once again, the sixth, does that mean A has to be flat? Again, no, not at all. What this is saying is that the sixth degree in the minor scale down at the bottom is a half fret or one semitone back from what the sixth is in the major at the top, right? Because that's A sharp. Same exact thing when we look at the seventh, right? Regardless if it's a diminished chord, we're talking about the notes here. We're not talking about the chord is diminished, not the note, right? And so does that mean the seventh has to be flat? Well, again, absolutely not. Here, again, it's just one semitone or one fret back. Now, let's take a look really quick, and this is just for clarity. Let's take a look and compare A major at the top to A minor at the bottom. A minor being our favorite, no sharps, no flats, right? So let's go ahead, we'll put the degrees in there, and now we will look at the third, right? So once again, if we're looking at the third, does that mean C flat? Well, no. There's no sharps, no flats in A minor. So it just means C in A minor, or the third, is one fret back than the C sharp as it is in A major, right? Just one fret, one semitone back. So that's all we're saying, right? Same thing with the sixth. The sixth degree in A major is F sharp. That doesn't mean that we have to do the sixth degree in A minor as F flat, not at all. It just means that it's a flattened position, right? The note has been flattened. Doesn't mean it's an F flat, it's just flattened from the major, right? Same exact thing when we look over at the seventh, right? It's not that it has to be G flat, it's just flattened, one fret back. And so that's it, right? And so this is how we get to our modes. Went a little bit over on that last part, but I think it was worth it to compare A minor with A major. So again, right, it's just difference on looking at the frets from the sharp to the naturals. And with that, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. What I'm going to do, just kind of last few minutes of the video, is I'm just going to give some kind of anecdotal comparisons here. One of the things when you're looking at this, which you'll see a lot of times in music theory books, and it's a headache. Just looking at this right off the bat gives me a headache. So we're guitarists, and one of the things that we do exceptionally well is find patterns, right? So if you're looking at this and thinking, wow, how am I going to memorize all this? Well, let's take it a little bit more simply. You'll notice that there's a few of them that have a major as the very first chord, right? And we call these the major modes. Here we have Ionian at the top. Then we have Lydian and Mixolydian. Well, notice something, that we've got the word Lydian in all the majors, right? Other than Ionian, which you're going to have to remember. But we can kind of take advantage of that. And what we can do to make things look even easier is just compare majors to majors, right? So we have major modes here: the Ionian mode, the Lydian, and the Mixolydian. These are all the major modes. And you'll notice, if I was playing a piece of music in major Ionian and I wanted to bring it into Lydian mode, the only real thing, I mean, I got to remember the majors and minors kind of, but they're really not too significant when you look at this. But I just got to remember that it has a sharpened fourth. That's it. Okay, cool. And then if I look at Ionian to Mixolydian, I don't really need to know too terribly much. It's got a flattened seventh. That's the only thing I really need to kind of pay attention to. And now, if I'm comparing major to major modes, things start to look a lot cleaner, a lot more simple for me. And then, right, we can do the same thing with minor modes. And you might be thinking, oh no, Dorian and Phrygian, I got to remember these two? No. Just, does it have the word Lydian in it? No, then it's a minor mode. Right off the bat, right? And if you're thinking, oh, what about Locrian? Well, Locrian technically has a minor third, so it could be argued that it's a minor mode. It's really kind of the leftover mode, but regardless, yes, it has the diminished fifth, so it's called the diminished mode, whatever. Half dozen one, six in the other, as a single letter or palindrome, however you want to look at it. I'll take care of Locrian in a completely different video. Just not used that much. But here, back to this, if we look at the minor modes, well, if I go from Aeolian to Dorian, okay, I've got a sharpened sixth. And if I go from Aeolian to Phrygian, all I need to really look at is that I have a flattened second. Now, that's pretty much about it. Right? So if I compare major modes to major modes, I don't really have to remember that whole table. Or if I compare minor to minor, it's pretty small changes. So anyways, with all of that, I wanted to put this out because I've been getting some questions about the modes, and I really wanted to put this out there. So kind of in conclusion, with all of that, right? Understanding your modes, do yourself a favor and just compare with the same tonic, right? C Ionian to C Aeolian or C Phrygian. Don't move that goalpost on yourself. So you're relying on the information rather than the pattern. And then when you're looking at trying to understand all the changes, look at the change between the major modes first. Really understand those, and then the changes between the minor modes between themselves. The changes there are very, very small, and I think it will help you out. And if you're going from a major mode, say Ionian, to a minor mode, Phrygian. Yeah, there's going to be some work there. Okay. But start saying, okay, I'm going to have a piece of music in A minor, and then transpose that to A Phrygian, A Dorian. Just kind of keep with the minors, and I think it will help you out quite a bit. And then here, final thought. It's so important, especially as guitarists. I know that, because I did it for years. We look at these patterns and we think that the patterns are giving us musical information, but it's the other way around, right? The musical information is what creates those patterns. It's a long road to just look at the patterns and try to understand the information going outward. You can, but it's the long road. Once you understand the information, the patterns they present themselves, and you go, oh, then you understand them. So keep that in mind. Don't rely too terribly much on just your patterns with that. So enough of that. But just again, pay attention to a little bit more in terms of the modes, and I think it will really help you out. Really appreciate everybody watching. And again, if you're getting something out of these videos, let me know. Give me a thumbs up, put a comment down there. Love replying to you guys. And again, it's free. hit that subscribe if you're getting something out of this, because it really helps the channel out. So with that being said, really appreciate everybody watching. And this was kind of a review, but I wanted to make certain that some of the questions I've been getting about modes got clarified. So as we start moving into chord progressions, everybody will be able to kind of join in on those conversations. So let me know what you if you have any questions or what you think about this down in the comments. I'll definitely get back to you. But until then, we will see you in the next one, where we will start diving into the chord progressions within modes. So with that being said, take care, everybody.